Well, welcome. My name is Nathan Mason, and I'm here today to introduce a topic that I did for my graduate research seminar last semester. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I developed it, and then walk you through the major sections of my paper and share with you some of the learnings that I uncovered. So my topic was the relationship between Kennedy and Khrushchev. My idea was to look at their relationship, how it played out through their letters, through their policies, and through their speeches. I wanted to see what messages were there between each other as they communicated through those three means. In their letters, as I started to read them, I saw a pattern with Khrushchev, and I saw a changing pattern within Kennedy. With Khrushchev, when I read his letters, they were rarely in a standard format. They were very personal, they were very customized, and as I read him, I could see he was trying to be very persuasive. His tone to me seemed to be the way a father talks to their son, kind of in an advising way. And Khrushchev typically was the one who wrote first. He would write Kennedy first. Kennedy, on the other hand, when you read his letters, seemed very standard form. They weren't very personal. They weren't full of a lot of persuasive arguments. They were full of America rhetoric and freedom is great rhetoric. But eventually that changed as I started reading his letters. And at times that standard rhetoric left and his personality started to creep into the letters more and more. He started to follow Khrushchev's lead. Since Khrushchev would write the letters first, Kennedy would start to follow the organizational structure that Khrushchev had set out in the first letter. I found that Kennedy started to agree on a lot of points that Khrushchev brought up instead of always arguing or trying to assert his own political views. And it reminded me of kind of how a son talks back to their father, being agreeable to try to get what you want instead of starting the conversation off with an argument. And I noticed that this shift occurred after their Vienna conference. So what I did with my paper was I wanted to look at their relationship first, before and after the Bay of Pigs, at their Vienna conference, and then going through the Berlin crisis. That way I could really see this shift that I saw through Kennedy's letters. And this was all a battle for influence. As you're reading these letters, you can really see these two men arguing back and forth to try to influence the other. My main research question was that the Berlin crisis didn't take the U.S. and Russia to war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, is seen in history as a big win for Kennedy. But how did Kennedy change his relationship with Khrushchev from one that showed his inexperience at the Bay of Pigs, one that showed him very weak at the Vienna conference, to a position of strength and dependability that Kennedy was able to show at the Berlin crisis, and then, of course, Kennedy was able to negotiate that big win at the Cuban Missile Crisis? How did that shift occur? Which led me to my thesis, which I'll read to you here, that although politically inexperienced compared to Khrushchev, Kennedy was able to use his affinity for understanding people to mimic Khrushchev's fears in such a way to elevate himself to a position of influence over Khrushchev, despite Kennedy's perceived inexperience politically. So now what I'd like to do is go through each section of my paper and kind of highlight my major findings that I think kind of support this conclusion that I came up with. I wanted to write my paper chronologically and keep it centered around Kennedy so that the reader would go through these events in the same way that Kennedy would have. So first thing, I talked a couple things about Kennedy's personality. Kennedy came from a strong family. His father was very educated with lots of people skills and organizational skills that Kennedy could learn from. Kennedy was able to understand, connect, and manipulate and charm people with his own charm. Side note, Kennedy also had a fascination with fascism and totalitarian governments. He wrote one of his theses on that subject. He was a very calculative thinker. When Kennedy was elected, the atmosphere at the time wasn't a calm world then, as it's not today. The major issue of the time then was, of course, Berlin. Khrushchev and the USSR wanted a peace treaty that would basically legitimize the two Germanys and take away the United States influence from Berlin. The United States, on the other hand, wanted more of an idea of unification, and the USSR would never allow that, because if Germany would become unified, it would undoubtedly join the West and become an enemy to the Soviet Union. So that kind of put the two superpowers at an impasse centered around Berlin. So let's look at their letters and their relationship around those events of the Bay of Pigs, Vienna, and the Berlin crisis. Starting with the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev's letters that he wrote to Kennedy pre-Bay of Pigs show again that strong language of a mentor who's giving advice to the new president, Kennedy. After the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev's letters changed to a "why aren't you listening? You're kind of messing everything up," with the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Kennedy appears to Khrushchev as weak because of the Bay of Pigs. But the weakness is not so much in JFK, it's in JFK's inability to control his own people, his inability to control the CIA, his inability to control the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So Khrushchev is not very impressed with Kennedy. He's kind of confused, kind of concerned about what's going on. After the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy got a really strong resolve to meet Khrushchev. Kennedy's post-Bay of Pigs letters show that he miscalculated how the Soviets would respond to the Cuban Missile Crisis, or to the Bay of Pigs. And Kennedy, of course, knows that his people skills come from charming people, so he really needs a face-to-face meeting. It was here in my paper that I wanted to introduce Khrushchev, because up until this point, I don't think Kennedy had spent too much time really understanding his adversary. Couple quick points on Khrushchev. He came from an opposite family from Kennedy, very poor, very weak, lack of education. And a side note for him, in the USSR, Khrushchev was on the wrong side of politics to begin with. He was more on the side of Trotsky before he flipped to Stalinism. In my opinion, I think this could have led to some insecurities for him, some fears, and maybe a drive to overcompensate. So at Vienna, when the two leaders met, their letters beforehand, Khrushchev, very personal, very friendly, but he's definitely flexing all that political clout after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Kennedy seems to have not been as prepared as Khrushchev, relied on his people skills, and Kennedy came there with this game plan of, you keep yours, I'm going to keep mine, and let's just leave each other alone. That backfired on him a little bit. It kind of showed concessions or weakness, according to Khrushchev, and really strengthened Khrushchev's resolve over wanting to take Berlin. Khrushchev, of course, was more convinced then that JFK was inexperienced, and because he was so young, perhaps he could work with Kennedy and mold Kennedy and influence Kennedy as a young leader. Post-Vienna, Khrushchev, of course, was having a lot of issues at home with East Germany, and he'd really kind of gambled and put all of his eggs in one basket with this Berlin idea, that he could take Berlin. Kennedy, after Vienna, started working in this West-East ideas. Kennedy's speeches before Vienna, he was always like, we need to stand with Berlin. After Vienna, Kennedy's speeches shifted to, we need to protect West Berlin. And he started throwing this westward in, which of course was another sign to Khrushchev that he would support this West-East idea. Kennedy also started reminding Khrushchev in his speeches that you're not just dealing with the president, who you may view as weak, but we have strong allies in NATO, and that if you were to try to move in on Berlin, you're not just fighting with the United States. And Khrushchev, of course, understood he couldn't take Berlin. Moving to the Berlin crisis, Khrushchev was able to fall back to Kennedy's concession of an East-West solution. Because of this, I kind of hypothesized that Khrushchev must have felt he could trust Kennedy a little bit, that he could do this and Kennedy would support him, or at least not challenge him on this. Kennedy understood that Khrushchev had put all his political capital in Berlin, and that he was failing in his attempt, that he was on weak, rocky ground. And really, Kennedy saved Khrushchev at this time by not moving in on the Berlin fiasco, or the Berlin crisis. Kennedy, of course, at this point is now finally starting to see and understand Khrushchev, how he operates out of fears and insecurities, how Khrushchev needed a way out. And Kennedy gave him that way out, and by keeping that promise, he was able to set a precedent of trust that he could use again in the future, like at the Cuban Missile Crisis. I would like to share just a quick side-by-side. This is two letters written between the two leaders. The first one is Khrushchev's letter dated September 29th, 61, and Kennedy's reply on October 16th. And what's interesting about these quotes is it kind of shows how Khrushchev wrote first and how Kennedy matched him point for point and thought for thought. So Khrushchev opens his letter talking about how he's on the Black Sea. You would love these surroundings, Mr. President. Kennedy opens his letter. I'm at Cape Cod. It's very beautiful here. I totally understand how you're talking about the Black Sea. Khrushchev moves to Vienna, where he talks about, wish it would have had a soothing event, but I don't think it really happened. But he was impressed with Kennedy's informality, modesty, and frankness. Kennedy doesn't miss a beat, answers right back with, these letters, should let us talk to each other in those frank terms. Neither of us is going to convert the other. This is the first time Kennedy kind of admits that in a letter and leaves out his America's great rhetoric, but does say that we need to understand each other. And then before they move into the politics, Khrushchev says, as you can see, I started off talking beautiful, but now we've automatically moved to politics. And Kennedy says, I understand, whether we wish it or not, for better or worse, we're the leaders of the world. And so as I started reading their letters, this is where I kind of started seeing Kennedy change from that standard form letter to moving to more and more of the following Khrushchev's beats. So, in summary, JFK was inexperienced when he first became president, and he misread his charm offensive at Vienna. But Kennedy was able to start seeing who Khrushchev was and influence him. Kennedy was able to do this because Khrushchev wrote strong letters to Kennedy as a mentor that showed lots of evidence that he had trust issues. But if he could trust JFK by trying to guide him, perhaps Kennedy could use that to his advantage and influence Khrushchev, kind of like Khrushchev laid all his cards out on the table and Kennedy was able to see what he could do. So thank you very much. Oh, there's one.
Did you go back to your thesis slide?
Could I? I probably could. It's on somewhere. Yes?
It's fascinating the way the rhetoric starts mirroring. Are there a lot of examples of that? And can you, is it Kennedy influencing Khrushchev? I mean, do you see shifts where one is influencing the other? Or do you think Kennedy's just mirroring? And let's hear more about that dynamic of who changes who and how they manage to come to these.
I came to more of the conclusion that at first Khrushchev influenced Kennedy because Khrushchev wrote several letters that Kennedy still sent back those standard form letters, kind of ignored certain points and just was like, capitalism's awesome, America's great, and just really felt like a speechwriter wrote it and there was no personality in it. But eventually he started talking more like a person, and so then I was like, aha, Khrushchev must have influenced Kennedy to do this. But then how I saw that Khrushchev ended following all of Kennedy's advice. And I'm like, well, how does that work? How does Khrushchev influence Kennedy, but then start listening to everything Kennedy says? And that's where I kind of came up with this mentor, father, son analogy of sometimes you can influence people who are above you if you let them think they're above you and use this kind of psychoanalysis type thing. And I think Kennedy was really good at that. When you read his biographies, especially the stuff he was able to do in high school and college to get elected to positions in those schools through his charm and offensive, it shows he was really able to manipulate people to his own advantage.
Well, I really wonder, because what you showed is not really so much manipulation as a real skill at reciprocity. Right? I mean, and I'm wondering what triggers, at what point Kennedy says, okay, enough with the America is great business. What is the trigger? What is the point at which you see this switch happening where Kennedy is able to say, okay, so this is, because all good communicators and politicians who are good communicators do this, right? They can mirror. And the better they are at mirroring, the better they are at having conversations and so forth, right? This is the art of compromise. So at what point does this happen?
I would say that was Vienna. If you read the transcripts of the Vienna conference, Kennedy almost seems like he's trying to convince Khrushchev of certain fallacies in the Soviet system and certain strengths in the American system, and it's not working. And then he tries other aspects, and Khrushchev is just really hard line against any ideas Kennedy is throwing out. And that led me to believe that Kennedy was really trying to rely on his charm, and it wasn't working. And so I think that's when Kennedy started to have to rethink his strategy with Khrushchev. And then that's when his letters changed. That's when his personality came out, that maybe he understood that Khrushchev had this feeling that he had to be top dog, and Kennedy had to play that to his advantage. There's one quote in the transcript where Khrushchev actually kind of says to Kennedy, "You remind me of my son." And so I think Kennedy picked up on those.
He was able to sort of reposition
things.
himself and engage stop, but they were able to eventually stop just kind of butting heads.
I think so. From the research I've done.
Very interesting.
How long had Khrushchev been in power before Kennedy came to the presidency?
54, 55, so about 5 or 6 years as the leader.
So he was kind of already entrenched.
Yes, he was already working with Eisenhower to try to solve the Berlin issue, but they didn't come to any conclusions. But yeah, he'd been in the government since the 30s. Obviously, he worked under Stalin as well. But yeah, he led the Soviet Union mid-50s.
Did you find any awareness of, in the letters, about Khrushchev's secret speech condemning Stalinism, and how much awareness there was that this might be an opportunity for a shift in?
Not in the letters, but I did read his secret speech, and I did read some of his other, I don't know if you'd call them speeches, but toasts that he gave at the Kremlin to the Politburo and others. And yeah, he definitely talked about a new beginning. An example is he had a lot of faith in Kennedy, Khrushchev did, before Kennedy got elected. And a beautiful example of that is the Soviet Union had captured some American pilots before Kennedy was elected. And Khrushchev said, "We're not going to release them until after Kennedy's elected because I don't want to hurt Kennedy's chances of getting elected." And when the two men first met, the first thing Khrushchev said to him is, "We voted for you." And Kennedy's like, "What do you mean you voted for me?" He's like, "The pilots. I didn't release them so you'd get elected." And Kennedy's like, "Oh, that was a big help." And so Kennedy started to see that Khrushchev had this mentor aspect towards him. So I really think it was at Vienna where Kennedy was finally able to start to see who Khrushchev was and how he could work with him.
Thank you.